All right, everyone, welcome back to the online lecture series of videos for Philosophy 102 Ethics. In this video, it's going to be the first of two videos on this topic. We're going to consider the question of the meaning of life. And to a certain extent, this might seem like a bit of an abrupt turn from where we were last time talking about utilitarianism and specifically hedonism. Hedonism being the theory that the pleasurable life is the best life, the only thing with intrinsic value is pleasure. But there are actually some very important connections between hedonism and this question of the meaning of life, and I'm going to spend most of this video trying to make that connection clear to you. So I think it's best to just jump right in, and the way I want to jump into this is with the following famous thought experiment. So here we have Robert Nozick, and this thought experiment, known as the experience machine, comes from his book, The Examined Life. And so let's just read through what this thought experiment is. Okay, so Nozick tells us, imagine a machine that can give you any experience or sequence of experiences you might desire. When connected to this experience machine, you can have the experience of writing a great poem, or bringing about world peace, or loving someone and being loved in return. You can experience the felt pleasures of these things, how they feel from the inside. You can live your fondest dreams from the inside. Would you choose to do this for the rest of your life? If not, why not? And he adds a little addendum here. Other people also have the same option of using these machines, which, let us suppose, are provided by friendly and trustworthy beings from another galaxy. So you need not refuse connecting in order to help others. Upon entering, you will not remember having done this, so no pleasures will get ruined by realizing they are machine produced. Okay, so what are we talking about here? Nozick's having us imagine that we could plug into some sort of machine that could simulate any experiences that you would want. So if you want to simulate the experience of running a marathon and winning, setting world record, you can do that. If you want to simulate the experience of sitting on a beach, sipping pina coladas, watching the waves crash upon the shore, you can do that. If you want to simulate the experience of your favorite celebrity becoming your significant other, you can simulate that. Whatever it is you want, you can simulate. And for our purposes, I would even take it a step further. Suppose that we knew this machine, because you might say, well, okay, I want to live the happiest life possible. Well, I might not know what set of experiences will give me the happiest, most pleasurable life. So let's imagine this machine could scan your brain, and upon scanning your brain, know what set of experiences would make you happiest. All right, so what is the point of the experience machine? Well, Nozick actually uses this concept, he uses this thought experiment as an argument against hedonism. And so let's sort of lay out his argument here. So I'll call this the experience machine argument. P1, if hedonism is true, then the experience machine provides the best possible life. P2, the experience machine does not provide the best possible life, so conclusion, hedonism is not true. So let's think about P1 for a second. If hedonism is true, then the experience machine provides the best possible life. Well, why would that be? Well, we just said that we're imagining the experience machine could produce the most pleasurable life for you. Hedonism says that the most pleasurable life is the best life. Therefore, it seems that the experience machine would give you the best life possible in terms of pleasure. There would be no other way of having a more pleasurable life than that. Now, one thing to consider at this point is that in our previous lesson, if you haven't watched it yet, you can go back and see the previous video on Mill's hedonism and the swine objection. We considered a similar sort of concept, right? So we imagined this man, Porky, who's a man who just spends all his time in the pigsty rolling around and is perfectly satisfied. And we asked ourselves the question, well, is this person living a good life? And of course, Mill says that, well, no, or he would say to that thought experiment, no, because Porky can't enjoy the higher pleasures. Well, so you might first ask yourself, would that sort of response here, could we say to someone who is going to plug into the experience machine, can we say to them, well, you wouldn't be able to enjoy the higher pleasures. You'd be missing out on this whole range of human experiences that makes you different from a mere animal. And the interesting thing is, well, no, response isn't really going to work. And that's because you can simulate whatever sort of experience you want. So yes, you could simulate just a life of, pure base pleasures of mere sensation, eating, drinking, sleeping, having sex, etc., etc. You could simulate that sort of life. But you can also simulate a life where you study philosophy, where you run a marathon, where you learn how to appreciate beauty, where you learn difficult musical skills, etc., etc., right? You could simulate a life where you pursue the higher pleasures. So, because that's the case, Mill's response isn't really going to work here. He can't just say that the person who plugs into the experience machine isn't enjoying the higher pleasures, because in fact they can. Okay. So, the real question is this, and this is where I invite you to think about this a little further. If you would not plug into the experience machine, what is stopping you? Right? Because let's think about P2. The experience machine does not provide the best possible life. Is that true? Right? So when you think to yourself and you say, okay, would I want to plug into this sort of machine or not? Would I want to live a simulated life that could provide the maximum amount of pleasure for me? What is it that's stopping you? What are you afraid might be lacking in your life if you did plug into that machine? Now, there are a few answers that come up. You might say, well, I wouldn't want to plug in to the machine and just my life be made easy, because then I wouldn't really enjoy the things I accomplish. Well, okay. But remember, we can program whatever set of experiences we want. So, let's go back to the previous example of running a marathon. So let's say running a marathon and winning and setting a world record would produce an extreme amount of pleasure for you and make you very satisfied. Well, you wouldn't want to just win right away, so we can program into the experience machine a situation in which you have to struggle for many years. You try and you fail and you try and you fail, you try and you fail, and then eventually you succeed. And so that's not really an issue. We can, if we need to program in hardship to your life, then we can certainly do that. And another thing to remember here is a lot of times how people react when they say, well, I wouldn't want to plug into this machine when I know I'm in the machine. Remember, the original idea is that you wouldn't know that your experience now would be indistinguishable from the machine. You're not aware you're plugged in. So the way I sometimes put it, which can freak people out, is that you could be in the experience machine right now, for all you know. So the main point of this thought experiment, then, is that if pleasure is really all that matters, then it seems like the best choice would be to plug into the experience machine. That would make, if there were such a machine, you should plug in. It would make your life better. Now, what's really interesting for our purposes is that Nozick doesn't think you should plug into the experience machine. And the reason he doesn't think you should plug into the experience machine is precisely because he thinks there's other things besides pleasure that matter. So he brings up a couple of these. So here are the two main things that Nozick thinks you would be missing out on if you plugged into the experience machine. So one is what he calls contact with reality. He says we care more about than just how things feel to us from the inside. Right? So remember when he originally explained the experience machine thought experiment, he said you can experience whatever you want just from the inside. You wouldn't actually be doing it. Maybe your body, your brain would be in a tank. You'd be plugged into a machine, but from the inside, it would feel the same. But Nozick tells us we care more about than just how things feel to us from the inside. There's more to life than feeling happy. We care about what is actually the case. We want certain situations we value, prize, and think important to actually be so. We want to be importantly connected to reality, not live in a delusion. We do not, of course, simply want contact with reality. We want contact of certain kinds, exploring reality and responding, altering it, and creating new actuality ourselves. Right? But the main point here is that, and I think the most important word of this passage is actuality. We want things to actually be the case. It's not enough, he thinks, that you feel like you won the marathon. It's not enough that you feel like you solved a really difficult math problem, or you feel like you finally understood a great work of art. What you truly want is for those things to actually be the case. And once you plug into the experience machine, all the things you engage in, you do, if those are even the right words, all those things you do are just a simulation. You're living a delusion. You're living a lie. So that's the first thing we would miss out on, according to Nozick, this contact with reality. Second thing he brings up is freedom. So he says, it seems too that once on the machine, a person would not make any choices, and certainly would not choose anything freely. One portion of what we want to be actual is our actually and freely choosing, not merely the appearance of that. So, in the experience machine, you would feel like you freely chose to train every day. You would feel like you chose to make the self-sacrifices necessary to set a world record marathon. But as a matter of fact, you wouldn't have freely made those choices, because even the simulated choices you made would just be the result of a computer program. So he thinks, once again, that we'd be missing out on having a sense of freedom, having free autonomous control over our lives. Okay, so there's a couple points to make here, right? A hedonist could push back, right? A hedonist might say, well, no, we don't actually really want contact with reality. People are perfectly fine to put up a false front or to put up a false representation of themselves that makes themselves feel good, that makes others like them. We're perfectly fine with that. Some people spend a lot of time getting lost in virtual reality worlds that aren't real but are easier and have less responsibility than the real world. And in terms of freedom, you can probably all identify certain times in your life when you'd like to give up a little freedom. Think of any of the big choices in your life. Where should I go to college? What should my major be? What career do I want to pursue? Should this person be my significant other? Will they be right for me? All these sort of big life choices you have to make. You might say, man, it would really be nice if sometimes, those choices could be made for me. If there was some reliable way that someone else could really know what would be best for me and just make the choice. Okay, so there's a way that hedonists could push back there. But for our purposes, what I want to ask a further question here. Right? And here's the question I want to ask. So suppose you entered the experience machine. Suppose it provided you with the happiest, most pleasurable life that's possible for you. Suppose you were good. You say, okay, I don't have contact with reality, fine. I'm going to give up some freedom, but I recognize that being in the experience machine is going to give me the most pleasurable life I could possibly live. So here's another question you could ask. Do you think you would be living a meaningful life? Right, so even if you accept that there would be no way to live a more pleasurable life than the experience machine, do you think a life in which you were simply plugged into a machine and had your whole life simulated for you, would that be meaningful? And as you're thinking about whether that would be a meaningful life, you should ask yourself the question, if you don't think it would be a meaningful life, why is that? Right? What does it mean to live a meaningful life? And what about a meaningful life would be lacking in that sort of scenario? And that's exactly the reason I bring this up, because there is a real question here. Even if Mill and the hedonists are right about what makes our lives go well, about what happiness is, even if they're right that happiness is pleasure enough for meaning? And should we care about having a meaningful life? So one way I think about it is this, right? So pretty much all the philosophers we have discussed so far are concerned with how to live a good life. I mean, of course you want to live a good life. What's the alternative? You don't want to live a bad life, so you should be concerned with what are some of the components of a good life. And these are some I would think of when I think of, okay, what does a good human life look like? Well, you might say you should be a morally good person. Maybe some amount of social connection matters. Maybe having control over your life matters. But there's these two other elements here. A good life should be one where you have some measure of well-being, where you're happy, where you're satisfied with the things you do, where your desires, the things you want, you get to a certain extent, where you feel pleasurable, right, to a certain extent. So well-being matters. But also meaning and purpose. The sort of idea that there's a point to your life, there's a point to your actions, there's some final goal. There's some aim that you're striving for. That also seems to be a thing that people care about, because as we're going to discuss a little later, when you're engaging in activities that you think are pointless, completely meaningless, that there's no need for them even to be done in the first place, this has a significant effect on how you conceive of how you're using your time. It has a significant effect of saying, wow, this is a complete waste of my time. And if your life as a whole is like that, if you don't have a sense that you have meaning or purpose in your life, you can see how that would, of course, undercut your ability to live a good life. So this is what I'm really going to be concerned with in this lesson. What is the difference between well-being and meaning? And what does it mean to say that one's life could be happy, but also meaningless? Okay, so I want to use a little more concrete example to make this point. So here's one question you should ask yourself. If you want to live a good life, then, well, should you become a parent? And here's a picture of my son Mason, dressed as a pineapple, and also apparently, looking at this picture, having a prodigious amount of drool. So this he's about 1 year old now, but this was taken around Halloween time. That was his Halloween costume. Okay, so let's say you are considering becoming a parent. And let's say you're also, of course, concerned with living a good life. One of the questions you should ask yourself is, will that choice make me happy? Will it give me meaning? Are those two different sorts of things? Okay. Now, we actually know a fair deal about parenthood in regards to these dimensions. So these passages I'm going to read to you come from an article, The Joys of Parenthood Reconsidered by Robin Simon. And she talks a little bit about some of the data we know about happiness and meaning as regards parenthood. So first she says, most of us still adhere to the cultural belief that there's no better guarantee of a happy, healthy, and emotionally rich and rewarding life than having children, who are presumed to be worth the financial and psychological costs associated with raising them. Although most people today would probably agree that parenthood is often challenging, sometimes difficult, and involves continual self-sacrifice, periodic disaster, and occasional heartache, particularly when children enter the tumultuous adolescent years, our culture continues to promote the idea that the emotional rewards associated with parenthood far outweigh the personal costs. Okay, so first, there certainly is this cultural belief that while parenthood is something that is costly in the sense, not just a monetary costly, but in terms of your time, energy, and resources, that although it's a costly endeavor, it will be paid off in some form or fashion. What's interesting is that many people sort of misunderstand the types of rewards it gives you. So contrary to all of this, sociological research based on national surveys of American adults finds an association between parenthood and depression, emotional distress, and other negative emotions. And here's the critical part. While studies indicate parents derive more purpose, more meaning, and greater satisfaction from life than non-parents, they also reveal parents experience lower levels of emotional well-being, less frequent positive emotions, and more frequent negative emotions than their childless peers. So this is a very sort of strange thing. At the same time as parents are more depressed, have more negative emotion, lesser levels of emotional well-being, parents also have more purpose and more meaning in their lives. And that should bring up an interesting question. Well, how is that possible? How could I be, on the whole, not in any given moment, but on the whole, more depressed, have higher levels of negative emotion, but also have a greater sense of meaning? Now, this phenomenon has a name. It's called the confounding hypothesis. And this hypothesis it explains this paradox that people keep having children even when doing so reduces happiness. And how do you explain this, right? So and this on a certain level makes no sense. If children objectively do make us less happy than we would be otherwise, why in the world do people continue to have them? Not just one child, but multiple children. Why would someone do that? It's because people tend to confuse happiness with meaning. So people thus may interpret or mistake the rewards of parenthood, which they know exist, as happiness, when they may have more to do with meaning. And what is meaning? Meaning can be defined as having a sense of purpose and direction in life, and that one's activities and efforts make sense and is part of something larger than oneself. So we're starting to get a little bit of a picture of how happiness and meaning are different. Happiness is something personal, something individual. If Mill is right, it involves, to a large degree, pleasure. But meaning is something maybe not different entirely, but it's something different. It involves having a sense of purpose, a larger goal, something outside of yourself. And if having children does anything, it certainly makes you live in a more self-sacrificial way that's certainly outside of yourself. Okay, so that's one way to sort of get into this issue, or to see the sort of idea. There's a difference between happiness and meaning. Now, there's another issue I want to bring up here as well. Oftentimes, when you think to yourself, what is the main way in which society encourages us to derive meaning from our lives? The main way is employment. Let's go back to, my son, who's 1 year old right now. Oftentimes, me and my wife will have thoughts of the sort of, I wonder what he'll grow up to be. And interestingly, like when we're asking that question, what will Mason grow up to be? We're not asking, what sort of hobbies will he have, or what is he going to do on the weekends? The underlying implicit assumption is we're asking, what is his employment going to be? What is his job going to be? And I think this is quite common. One of the most common ways we're encouraged to derive meaning is from whatever way it is that we make money, that we're employed. And this is, on its face, it's sort of a strange thing, because you might say, why would we make the way we derive meaning primarily a function of what do you do to get other people to give you money? And it's an increasingly sort of dangerous proposition, especially in an age of increasing automation. So these numbers come from an article which essentially outlines the percentage chance that various professions, various jobs are going to become automated. So for instance, at the very top, telemarketers. This seems obvious. Telemarketing certainly seems like something a machine can do, and sometimes machines, in fact, do it currently. So no huge surprise there. But one of the things that really stuck out to me is that some of the jobs on this list with relatively high probabilities of being automated were what we might call cognitive labor, right? Labor where you're using your mind, the sort of thing we don't usually think about when we're thinking about automation of work. So one example here is paralegals and legal assistants. So this is from the article. They say, in addition, computerization is entering the domains of legal and financial services. Sophisticated algorithms are gradually taking on the number of tasks performed by paralegals, contract, and patent lawyers. More specifically, law firms now rely on computers that can scan thousands of legal briefs and precedents to assist in pretrial research. Now, this should be somewhat concerning. If we have a society set up to say that, a main way in which we derive meaning from our lives is from our job, specifically jobs with a high cognitive component, and if many of those jobs are very much threatened to go by the wayside through automation and computerization, then this isn't, it creates all sorts of issues, economic issues, social issues, political issues to be sure, but it also creates a philosophical issue. It creates an issue of meaning, of rethinking, reconceptualizing how it is that we can garner meaning in our lives. And as far as I'm concerned, the issues with deriving meaning from work in general and employment go even deeper than this. So here's this, there was a recent book in 2018 by David Graeber called Bullshit Jobs, A Theory. So here's David and here's his book. And he outlines, this concept of a bullshit job. And once I explain this concept, you'll immediately think, I probably had one of these. So what is a bullshit job? A bullshit job is a form of paid employment that is so completely pointless, unnecessary, or pernicious that even the employee cannot justify its existence, even though, as part of the conditions of employment, the employee feels obliged to pretend that this is not the case. So A bullshit job is a job where you know deep down in your heart, on the inside, that there's no reason for this job to exist. But it does exist. You are employed in it and making money that way, and you feel this obligation to pretend that, oh, this really is necessary. And in his book, he goes through these various different types of bullshit jobs, but I think the best way to explain this is to have him explain it to you. So this is a little portion I'm going to play from a podcast on NPR's Hidden Brain entitled BS Jobs. I encourage you, if you get the chance, to listen to the whole thing. It's really interesting. But I'm just going to play a few minutes of this for you, and where he explains some examples of bullshit jobs.
Or visit a store today. Restrictions apply.
Working a bullshit job might feel like an exercise in futility, a task that seems completely pointless. In truth, there's a perverse logic that shapes how and why these jobs come to be. David Graeber has brought an anthropologist
all over your house. You can even pause
The first category is something he calls a duct taper. Rather than fix serious headaches, many organizations take the easy route. They paper over the problem. David has a revealing story from his own life.
This was quite early on in my time in the UK university system, and they had this shelf in my office. I was always a little worried about it. It seemed kind of precarious, and one day it just completely ripped out of the wall. There was this huge gaping hole in the wall. There's this kind of mangled metal, hanging over my desk. There's obviously no way I could fix it myself, and so I called buildings and grounds, and, they said, okay, we'll send a carpenter. And it took about a week and a half for the carpenter to show up, and people in the office were calling, I was calling, everybody was calling, and it became this daily ritual. And I gradually realized there's one guy, we always got the same guy, whose entire job seemed to consist of apologizing for the fact that the carpenter was very busy and couldn't come. And one day it occurred to me, why don't they just fire that guy and hire a second carpenter? Because then they won't need him, right? And I mentioned this to various people, and they looked at me like, yeah, right, that would ever happen. And I realized that this is a perfect example of a bullshit job. His job is only necessitated because the system is stupidly constructed. So he's there to, it's the equivalent of if you had a leak in the roof. Instead of fixing the roof, you hire some guy to empty a bucket every hour. It's a totally pointless position. And gradually I realized that in the software industry, at least, this is called duct taping.
I want to talk about a second category of bullshit jobs, David. This one involves managers who come up with meaningless assignments for their subordinates. You call them taskmasters?
That's right. Now, a taskmaster is a type of bullshit job which involves there's two different types, actually. One of them is simply a supervisor of people who don't need supervision. And a lot of middle managers wrote to me and said that they had that kind of job. Often they'd done a certain job, they got promoted to management, so they knew what was entailed in doing the job, and they knew that basically they didn't need supervision at all, but they had to pretend they were supervising them anyway. But another type is exactly what I was describing in the case of universities, people whose job seems to end up being creating paperwork and unnecessary tasks for other people to do. So again, to go back to the middle management example, say you did have a job and you got promoted to supervising that job and you knew that they didn't need supervision. Gradually, you would realize that rather than just sit here all day, probably the best thing you could do to look good to your boss is to create some kind of target system. Give them paperwork to do to make sure they're hitting their targets, and then there'll be something to file and process, and you'll have something that you can do.
The classic example comes from the story of a woman named Chloe.
she was one of the few people who was in academic administration in the higher echelons who was willing to come forward and admit this to me. She said, well, I took on this job as a non-executive dean. It says non-executive basically means you have no power, you don't control money, so you're strategic. You're supposed to come up with ideas, but you have no real ability to make anybody do that. So essentially she had a pointless job. She would come up with a plan and then nobody would pay any attention. However, she was given 3 assistants. Again, that's what happens. As soon as you get a prestigious position, they immediately give you assistants, and then you have to figure out something for them to do. In her case, none of them had any obvious function, so she had to spend her time making up things for them to do so they wouldn't get in trouble for just sitting around.
So you can have BS jobs to help the boss feel like he's actually necessary when he isn't. You can have BS jobs that are designed to paper over problems that an organization cannot or...
Okay, so there you see a couple different types of bullshit jobs, right? You have jobs where, the guy is just answering the phone to tell people the carpenter is not available when they could easily just hire an additional carpenter. People managing people who don't need to be managed, people creating paperwork that doesn't need to be filled out just so people have things to do. They're just the perfect example of busy work. And one of Graeber's findings is that these jobs are much, much more common than we might want to admit to ourselves, and that actually a significant portion of our economy of employment is filled with exactly these sorts of jobs. Now, why does this matter for us? Again, it's a very sort of troubling situation if, in fact, one of the main ways in which we're encouraged to find meaning is through our work, and if much of that work is pointless, if much of that work is bullshit, then we might really start to think about, well, maybe we need some deeper reflection on what exactly it means to live a meaningful life and how we ought to pursue that. And so again, one thing this brings out for us is that there's a deep sense in which meaningfulness, or really meaninglessness, is connected to pointlessness, right? A meaningful life is a life with a point, a purpose, something you are pursuing that's valuable. Okay. Now, to end this video, I want to just introduce the reading from Taylor that you're doing this week. So in the article, The Meaning of Life by Richard Taylor, he discusses, from a philosophical point of view, this question of a meaningful life. And so I want to introduce a few concepts of that, and we'll mostly cover that article in the next video I do on this topic. But this is the first paragraph, I believe, of his article. And Taylor tells us, the question whether life has any meaning is difficult to interpret. And the more you concentrate your critical faculty on it, the more it seems to elude you, or to evaporate as any intelligible question. So he says the meaning of life is a question that part of its difficulty comes from the more you focus on it, the more it seems difficult to answer. And why might it be difficult to answer? Well, here's what Taylor says. You want to turn it aside as a source of embarrassment, as something that, if it cannot be abolished, should at least be decently covered. So I think one of the sort of hang-ups about thinking about the question of the meaning of life is the very possibility that our lives as a whole could be like one of those bullshit jobs, that when you really look at it, when you're not just, if your job is creating paperwork that doesn't need to be done for subordinates who don't need to be there, you might be able to get along okay as long as you don't think about it, right? If you're just doing your job, you're checking things off your to-do list, and it's all fine. But once you start to really examine it and think, this is how I'm spending my time, doing this pointless bullshit task, well, that can be an extremely sort of depressing realization if this is a significant chunk of your life. But imagine now how much more depressing that would be if the same is true when we look at life as a whole. When we look at our lives as a whole, and not just our jobs, but how we spend the entirety of our lives, and when we take a critical eye toward that, and we recognize, possibly, that life as a whole is meaningless, that life as a whole is pointless, well, how much more depressing would that be? And of course, this would be a possibility that the human mind would not necessarily want to face up to. And yet, Taylor continues on, I think any reflective person recognizes that the question it raises is an important and ought to have a significant answer, so we're in a bit of a troubled spot. There's a part of us that doesn't want to look at this question because of what the answer might be. On the other hand, if you are a person who reflects on your life, if you live and examine life, you have a sense that this is the sort of question you should be able to answer. You should be able to have some answer for what makes a life meaningful and whether the lives we in fact do live are meaningful. Now, to sort of bring home the sorts of possibly negative effects that reflecting on this question can have, I want to return to our friend John Stuart Mill. Now, the passage I'm going to read you now is not from Utilitarianism, it's from his autobiography. And one of the most famous parts of his autobiography is where he described a sort of mental breakdown, a sort of crisis of meaning that he had in his own life. So here's Mill in his autobiography. He says, I had what might truly be called an object in life, to be a reformer of the world. Right? So you'll recall Mill is a utilitarian, and that just wasn't a theoretical interest for him, it was practical as well. He really believed that one should, in their life, try to act to make the world a better place, to improve happiness for the greatest number of people possible. So we see Mill advocating for things like freedom of speech, democracy, equal rights for women. He really pursued all these causes in the hope that they would eventually make the world a happier and freer place. Okay, so that was his purpose, to be a reformer of the world. My conception of my own happiness was entirely identified with this object. The personal sympathies I wished for were those of my fellow laborers in this enterprise. And he says, as a serious and permanent personal satisfaction, my whole reliance was placed on this. And I was accustomed to felicitate myself on the certainty of a happy life, which I enjoyed through placing my happiness in something durable and distant, in which some progress might always be making while it can never be exhausted by complete attainment. So he said, look, where did my happiness come from? I see society right now has problems. Right? He says society right now has serious problems, serious inequalities, serious injustices. But he says, I can envision a better society. I can envision a society which works better, which produces more happiness for more people, in which there's more equality, more freedom. I can see that society off in the distant future. And he said, where I got my happiness and my purpose was from seeing myself as working toward that ultimate end. And he says, he realizes that work's never going to be done in his lifetime, so he's always going to have something to work toward. Okay, so everything seems fine. He has a purpose in life, he's working toward it, he seems happy. So what happens? The time came when I was awakened from this as from a dream. It occurred to me to put the question directly to myself. Suppose that all your objects in life were realized. So what does that mean? He's imagining himself, well, I was just putting that far away sort of future, I was thinking about it as something to be attained in a sort of distant future. Not now, but something I'll never attain, but something to be attained in the distant future. But now let me actually imagine that everything I'm working for were actually realized. That it actually happened. We were successful. That all the changes in institutions and opinions which you were looking forward to could be completely affected, put into practice at this very instant. And then he asked himself, would this be a great joy and happiness to you? So he asked himself, if I was successful in the things I'm advocating for, would that make me happy? And he says an irrepressible self-conscious answer, no. At this my heart sank within me. The whole foundation on which my life was constructed fell down. The end has ceased to charm, and how could there ever be any interest in the means? Sorry about that. I seem to have nothing left to live for. So Mill says, and this should be really sort of troubling to you if you take it seriously. He said, when I really sat down, I asked myself, would I be satisfied? Would I be made happy if everything I was working toward came to fruition? He says, no. It actually wouldn't bring me the happiness that I think it would. And if that's really true, if whatever it is in your life that you're pursuing, whatever it is in your life you think is important, if you, one of the scary things about that is you don't actually know 10, 5, 10, 15, 20 years down from the line from now if that's what you'll want to do. You don't know if that's something you're going to care about, because 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, you'll be a different person. And if it's also the case that if achieving your goal doesn't satisfy you, doesn't make you happy, if that means you have nothing left to live for, if that means your actions are pointless, then that's a very sort of scary thought, because that's exactly what happened to Mill. Once he imagined himself being successful in the things he was trying to pursue, it no longer made him satisfied, and he says he fell into a deep depression. As he goes on to explain, he felt he had no sense of anything to live for. So the reason I bring this up is because this is a perfect example of how the sort of question of meaning can creep up. You can be sort of pursuing something that seems, from an objective point of view, to be very important. The changes you want in society do seem like they're important changes. And for all that, it still may not be the case that it's enough to make your life meaningful. That's enough to make you satisfied. So I'll stop there. We're going to come back to this example of Mill in our next video as well. So I hope that was helpful. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.